Well, welcome back and greetings. We're going to continue with this second lecture dealing with the rise of modern secularism. Last time we noted that there was the First Amendment in the Constitution and for not establishing a religion and the freedom to practice religion. We discussed that, but we also saw in some of the court decisions that the practice of religion was being curtailed, at least in the public sphere. And so that kind of sets the backdrop for the development of secularism. But now we're going to see some of the socio-cultural aspects that also are contributing to a more secular view of the world we live in. In other words, a world in which the spiritual dimension is at best deemed not important or ignored completely, or just people saying that it's foolish to think in those terms. So we're going to be continuing looking at some of the factors that are continuing to influence the rise of secularism. So let me share the screen here, and we can get started. All right. Well, we're going to continue to see the split that we talked about at the beginning of the first lecture, and this part right here, where the Christian perspective there, but you have these areas that Christianity has influence in as well, but there is the secular influences in these sections as well: the knowledge sector, science and reason, wealth accumulation, and popular media. And those with the Christian perspective worldview, work out of this as well, but there is a secular worldview as well, and the gap continues to widen. You can say there's basically three forces that were developing from the time of the Enlightenment period, which are represented by those four sectors. And that is the secular humanistic philosophy in the knowledge sector and reason that's going on. And this was being propagated in the academy or the academic institutions, particularly those who are non-Christian in orientation. Also, evolutionary theory and materialism, where you have science and reason that buys into the evolutionary theory, or that the world is just materialistic and there is no spiritual dimension. In other words, a closed worldview. But modernization, it has its effects as well, where you have wealth accumulation, the media, all of these push people to think, we can do this as human beings, and human beings can do so many things and continue to progress and solve all the problems of the world, which, of course, in the 20th to the 21st century hasn't turned out to be very true. We continue to have incredibly difficult problems. A good video to watch, and I have posted it for you to watch as well. Why is Christianity crucial to the Western world? By Os Guinness, who is also the author of the book The Call that you've been reading as well. And he has some interesting things to say, and so please be sure to access that and take notes on that as well. So we're going to be looking at these various forces, sociocultural forces that have contributed to the rise of modern secularism. We go back to the Enlightenment period, the 18th century. In that time period, this was a time where humanistic thinking was growing, and it has some of its roots in aspects of Greek philosophical thinking. But the idea here was they were putting more and more emphasis on the ability of humanity. And in that time period, as industrialization was coming along and modernization, it was easy for people to fall into the trap that the world is getting better, we're getting smarter, we're doing all this industry and technology, and humans are just getting better and better, and they're going to solve all the problems. Well, it won't be long into the 20th century with World War I and World War II and many other things that a lot of people were questioning that thinking anyway. But it still didn't stop the philosophy, the humanistic philosophy. But humanism, the term humanism can be used in a lot of different ways. And so we need to be careful how it's used, because there is a sense in which you can be humanistic in the sense of caring about humans, which Christians should care about humans. So we need to keep that in mind. So positively, it refers to the dignity of human beings and improving the human condition. Whether you're Christian or secular, you tend to agree that that should be part of being a humanist. But negatively, it can refer to a belief system which humans beings replace God as a central source of knowledge and ethical decisions. In that use of the term humanism, it just says everything revolves around the human, and you don't have any room for anything outside of a human being and the physical realm. And so that would, when we use the term humanism in this course, we're using the first one. But when we talk about secular humanism, and there's some other terms you'll see later, that's referring to the second part. And so that way we can kind of distinguish between those two. Humanism, here's one of the definitions, a couple of definitions you find out there. A system of thought that rejects religious beliefs and centers on humans and their values, capacities, and worth. Now notice this one goes more with the negative side, and so it's taken humanism to not just mean caring about humans. And so then you'll find this is often the case when they use the term humanism. Also, it's historically a cultural and intellectual movement of the Renaissance and Enlightenment that emphasized secular concerns as a result of discovery and study of the literature, art, and civilization of Greece and Rome. And there's truth in that, but it doesn't leave out the possibility of religious beliefs and things, but it does emphasize secular concerns. And so humanism in itself tends towards the secular aspect of humans, but like we saw, a broad definition just means a concern for humans. So there is a sense where you can have a Christian humanism in that. And here is an example. Webster's third New International Dictionary says Christian humanism is a philosophy advocating the self-fulfillment of man, or you might say people, humanity, within the framework of Christian principles. That's why you can be humanist and still be Christian, because humanist in and of itself is just a concern for humanity, which Christianity would say is one of its main tenets. But on the other hand, what we're going to do is we're going to use the terminology to distinguish these humanism from that broad spectrum to secular humanism, or sometimes they call it modern humanism, naturalistic humanism, scientific humanism, ethical humanism, and even democratic humanism. So you see these terms used, and these are generally defined as Corliss Lamont says, as a naturalistic philosophy that rejects all supernaturalism, religion, spiritual beliefs, and relies primarily upon reason and science, democracy, and human compassion. And so, and I think overall that's a good definition for secular humanism. So I will generally just use the term secular humanism in the course to distinguish it. Also, besides secular humanism, we'll be talking about, uh, in essence, we don't live in a real secular society, although we see a rise in secularism in the sense that people who are atheists or agnostic, 5% maybe of the US population, but 15% are people who are not affiliated with a religion. But that doesn't necessarily mean they don't think that there is a spiritual dimension. So still, it is a minority of people who are totally secularists or secular humanists in that regard, and certainly a good number of that 15% are philosophically wouldn't adhere to secular humanism totally. But we do live in a society that's very pluralistic, and so we need to think about that as well. Pluralism, uh, religious pluralism, is when there are many religions or a plurality of religions in which people participate within a society. And not only would you have the religions, but you could also have secular thinking, secular humanism, which by our own Supreme Court has now dubbed it also a religion, but it doesn't look beyond itself to the transcendent as we define religion. However, that's part of the pluralism that's in our country today, besides all the different religions. And so the US is very pluralistic, and that we have many religions, and we have the freedom to worship whatever way we want. And of course, in Christianity itself, there's many denominations of Christianity. When Christianity came into the world, it came into a pluralistic society. So don't think that what we're experiencing now as Christians in our pluralistic society, with all these beliefs around us, secularism around us, and all the things that go with it, that are lifestyles contrary to Christian teaching, and that kind of thing, and violence and problems. When Christianity came in the world initially with Christ, and then as the early church started, they came into an extremely pluralistic world, probably more so than what's here in the U.S. And certainly the challenges of the lifestyles and the what you call crime, and just how difficult it was to live, and violence of the time period was more than we see here in the U.S. If you read that back in the history, and as you're reading through Schmidt's book on how Christianity changed the world, you'll see this. And so realize that Christianity began in an environment like that, and prospered and grew. And so just keep in mind too, beyond the various religions are the secular humanistic aspects of our society as well, to keep in mind. So this developing split of the spiritual and secular we saw when we have that crossroads there, in the center is the Christian perspective, and then the different sectors that are influencing our modern world, and then you got Christian worldview, and then the secular worldview. You can trace the beginning of this back to the Renaissance, and then scientific revolution, 16th, 17th century, and then Enlightenment, especially getting into that time period, where the emphasis is moved from it's looking at God and humanity's relationship with God, to spending more time centering on humanity and its potential. And so it begins, as we've mentioned, the idea was already there, present with before Darwin came along, that the humanity is progressing, and it's just going to get better, and we're going to eventually be able to build a utopian system and that kind of thing. And so humanity becomes the center of things, and we'll talk about this later, is the autonomy of the individual. It becomes important. And and so with the Enlightenment comes the industrialization, the modern period, in the 19th and 20th centuries. And you have philosophers coming in this time period that really they they really center on the fact that there is only the only this world that is a closed worldview system, which is only the material world. And just Friedrich Nietzsche is one of those, and he was highly influential, for example, with the Nazism. Uh, but he's the one that proclaimed God being dead. He as being dead. But what he was saying in saying those words was he was indicating that the Enlightenment thinking and moving into the towards the 20th century had killed him in the sense Western culture was now excluding him from public life. Now, you got to remember that still most people in the U.S. were highly religious, and a vast majority, probably in that time period, over 90% would have been Christian, or at least espouse an open worldview. But he was coming from the Academy of Europe and things like that. And their thinking was that all of this was moving towards a more secular world. And it really hasn't turned out to do that as quickly as they thought, but there is still some movement in that direction. So it kind of has secularization has its genesis really in the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, like Thomas Paine wrote. And then Darwinism, this with this evolutionary theory and materialism comes into play here. And as we mentioned before, the idea of things just moving forward was already there, but Darwin did, as we talked about, set a scientific foundation for that from a biological perspective. But it's the philosophical side, this commitment to the idea of progress of humanity and humanity's ability, and that all there is this material dimension, which is supported by evolutionary theory, that there is no spiritual side to humanity. And so all of that is intertwined in what we're talking about, the influence of various socio-cultural movements that are pressing this secular thinking. And so those sectors that we talked about earlier and are referred to here in this image right here are what we're going to be looking at as we go forward. As historically, as the U.S. goes forward, you have various movements and societies that are put forward to push the secular agenda. So the secular humanism philosophy is something that certain leaders in that field they push it as a alternate view of the world, as a closed world view understanding. And so we'll look at a few of those as we go forward here. This one we're talking about here is founded in 1876 by Rabbi Dr. Felix Adler. So this Society for Ethical Culture was basically espoused a secular humanism. It merged with other organizations that formed what's now called the American Ethical Union. And you can click on the link there. And it was also founded by Adler in 1889. And it became the center of what would become secular humanism, which basically teaches that God does not exist and that man is perfectible, self-sufficient in the measure of all things. So you can see they exclude all of the spiritual dimension. Just their philosophical foundation worldview is that that aspect is a part of humanity, and if somebody thinks about it, it's religion. It's just being made up in your mind, like we've talked about already. And but the interesting thing is say that man is perfectible. Well, since 1889 and 20th century, you can just look back at the world wars that were fought, and then other wars, and then the rise of communism and the millions of people that were executed in tens of millions in the Russian and China revolutions to secure communism there. I mean, the perfectibility just isn't really happening. And even looking around us today, we can be very sure that we're lacking in the perfectibility area. So, but this is the philosophy. The first Humanist Society of New York was founded in 1929 by Charles Potter. And interesting for him, they were very active in promoting the secular humanism. And you can see this in what he wrote in 1930 in the book Humanism, A New Religion. So notice he calls it a religion. And won't be long after that it'll be actually, the Supreme Court will also call it a religion. But education is thus a most powerful ally of humanism, and every American public school is a school of humanism. What can the theistic Sunday schools meeting for an hour once a week and teaching only a fraction of the children do to stem the tide of a 5-day program of humanistic thinking, of teaching, humanistic teaching? So notice his view of it is that if we secularize the school, and notice this is before the early court case of Emerson, where they're removing religion from public schools and things, and they're already talking about it back before that, and that they want to secularize the education system. And this was supported by Horace Mann, who was involved in public schools, promoting them, and he promoted humanism in the public schools. And so realize that this was all going on before the Supreme Court cases began coming down that would start moving religion out of the public sphere and public schools. By 1941, they formed the American Humanist Society, and it was founded by Curtis Reese and John Dietrich. They were two well-known Unitarian ministers and humanists. They reorganized what was called the Humanist Press Association in Chicago into the American Humanist Association. And so notice how many of these societies are coming into being and exist even to this day. And I give you a link here for American Humanist Society. You get writings that come out of secular humanism, and one of the first ones to come out that was made popular was the Humanist Manifesto 1 in 1933. We'll just summarize it, but we're going to come to the Humanist Manifesto number 2, which is the most complete, and look at it specifically later on. But we get a impression here, or we can see the progression that's going on with what's happening in society related to pressing the secular humanist perspective. It was signed by 34 prominent national figures, including educator John Dewey. And what you'll find a lot of this is tied into education, and it was particularly up in higher education as well, but it was being pressed into public school systems, elementary and secondary schools. It rejects traditional Christian beliefs, it says, It supports naturalism, materialism, rationalism, and socialism. And so naturalism, basically everything's by natural law. There is no moral law other than what happens in the natural world. Materialism means there's only a material world, there's no spiritual world. And rationalism is the perspective that everything that can be figured out can only be done by reason. And then they throw in socialism as as important to their agenda. That's the kind of political system that they espouse, that they think will make the world a better place. The importance of the document is that more than 30 men have come to a general agreement on the matter of final concern, and that these men are undoubtedly representative of a large number who are forging a new philosophy out of the materials of the modern world. And this was somebody that agreed with this manifesto, Raymond Braggs, and he was writing, about that this was a step forward in society, and as they come up with this manifesto. And it'll be built on as years go by, as we'll see later on. This brings us to Turcazo versus Watkins in 1961, a court case. And this is the court case that would say that secular humanism can be recognized as a religion, so they can claim a religious status in the eyes of the court. They note that among religions in this country which do not teach what would generally be considered a belief in the existence of God are Buddhism, Taoism, ethical culture, secular humanism, and others. And it is true, there are religions like Buddhism and Taoism that there is no God. The ultimate thing beyond them is something other than God. For them, the spiritual world is quite different or non-existent. So in that way, if you use a broader definition of what religion is, that's not the one we're using in this one, because we do say that religion, in our definition, you have to have something transcendent. And for example, Buddhism doesn't have God, but they have a transcendent sense of saying we have to be released from this cycle of samsara, or what we would call reincarnation. And to reach that, we have to meditate our way out, and then be released from nirvana. And nirvana, that is the thing beyond humans, but it's ceasing to exist, basically. And so, but in either case, you end up with secular humanism becoming more prominent in the modernization, and people begin looking to humanity as the answer to everything. And the idea from this perspective is there's no need for God. We can keep pushing him out, and particularly we don't want him involved in what's going on in the public sphere. And so in a sense, it's a political movement, but also a philosophical movement. But you can see it has real world effects by pressing agendas that get prayer out of the school, and religion, and reinterpreting the First Amendment, the right to practice your religion, freedom to practice your religion. It's putting constraints on that weren't there to begin with the first 150 years of the United States. So all this is stuff that's pushing secular humanism, and that's what's giving rise to it, and continues to be doing so even today. Here's a Secular Coalition, which was founded in 2002. So now we're moving forward in time even further. And if you look that up, you'll find there's 19 secular humanist groups that are listed as members of the organization. They say specifically on their website, our mission is to increase the visibility of and the respect for non-theistic viewpoints in the United States and strengthen the secular character of our government. So they make it very clear it's a political movement as well as philosophical movement, non-theistic, not including God viewpoints. And they want to make that part of, the characteristic of our government. And although our government never was established to be that way, and certainly the founding fathers said just the opposite, that you had to have the Christian perspective in there and the Christian morals that go with it. Otherwise, this whole system, they thought, would crash. And we, that is part of what we have to think about as we go forward. So you got things like the American Atheist Group, the American Humanist Association under them, the Atheist Alliance of America, Secular Student Alliance, which are societies within public institutions that push the secular agenda. They have meetings and everything. Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science, and many of the others. So, but just to be aware, this is an organized movement and does have spokespeople and pushes agendas, especially in public schools, and certainly very strong in public and the academia of higher education in the public spheres and those public institutions. So as we think about this going forward, modernization to secularization idea, there's been various ways it's been described. One of the ways that's interesting is talking about modernization and modernity. It's as Habermas, Jürgen Habermas, he's a philosopher, modern philosopher. He talks about modernity is associated with what he calls the Enlightenment project, or the project of modernity. So notice it goes back to the Enlightenment thinking that's putting all the emphasis on humans as the center of everything and solving every issue. But he also says it's sometimes called the project of modernity. And here's how he describes that. And being a typical philosopher, he's very verbose, and you really have to try to follow what he's saying with a lot of words in a long sentence. But what he does say is true, but you have to kind of wade through it a bit. This project finds its genesis in the 18th century Enlightenment. So he points back to what we've said. The Enlightenment is kind of the main beginning point for this kind of secularist thinking. It is composed of the ongoing development of the, now notice, objectivating sciences, the universalistic basis of morality and law, and the autonomous art in accordance with internal logic. Okay, now that's a mouthful just in and of itself, and he's not done. Objectivating science means that they're only looking at the scientific method, saying science can help solve all the issues, and is the universal basis that'll become the basis for morality and law. And then he goes on, the autonomous art in accordance with internal logic. In other words, human reason is basically the center of what will solve problems, and this Enlightenment project, and that is based on human reason, nothing to do with the spiritual realm. But at the same time, a release of the cognitive potentials thus accumulated for the esoteric high forms and their utilization in praxis. In other words, using your cognitive potential, and that's all that's needed for this Enlightenment project, and whatever you can do with your mind. Utilization in practice means you use that reason to do whatever you need to do in society and culture, and organization, rational organization of living conditions and social relations. So he's basically saying on reason alone, on humans' ability alone, and rational thinking and the use of science, we can organize our living conditions and social relations. And so he's saying this kind of view, you know, excludes the spiritual side, and just based on human ability and reason and science, will be able to take care of all the living conditions and social relations. And so that's quite a mouthful to wade through, but he is right. And he's making a point here that this project is an ongoing, continuing thing. And he wrote this back in 1992. Another writer, Netland, who was one of my professors, he talks about modernity and its influence on the secularization movement, and as you know, with the rise, helps with the rise of modern secularism. He says it's characterized by an emphasis upon the capacity of reason to uncover universal truths. So we saw that Habermas. He puts it in a little bit plainer language: capacity of reason to uncover universal truth, the rejection of superstition and excuse me, religious authoritarianism. So from their perspective, they look at religion as superstition and religion as being authoritarian. In other words, setting down the laws and what's right and what's wrong, and understanding of science as producing ever more accurate picture of the universe and human person. So notice again, science becomes, you know, what humans can do through scientific process, and they continue, and that they see that producing a more accurate picture of the universe and human person. And with the expectation that science, technology, and education working together will eradicate problems and progressively improve human life. Excuse me. So notice that human ability with all this science and technology and education are going to solve, you know, improve human life and solve our problems. And a general toleration for various creeds and ways of life, so long as they do not conflict with what reason sanctions. So notice they're okay with a lot of toleration, but don't try to bring in something that they don't think fits well with reason, which is generally something religious in that. And so that's his way of describing pretty much the same thing that Habermas is saying earlier. Modernization, secularization, to summarize, or originating in the 18th century Enlightenment, we see an increasingly globalized culture that is rooted in the process of modernization. It's associated with economic, industrial, and social transformations, and progressively moving worldwide, which is what we call globalization. And we'll get back to some of this terminology, modernization, modernity, and things like that. But we have to realize that this is the intellectual heritage of the West, this Enlightenment thinking during the past 300 years. So it's important to keep in mind that historical perspective, and we can see the different things that happen with secular thinking and with the societies and everything going on as we move forward in what we're looking at here with the rise of modern secularism. Last slide for this presentation. A reminder, I think I mentioned earlier this, but I'll bring it up again, the secularization thesis or theory, which in the mid to late 20th century, it expressed the idea that as societies progress, particularly through modernization and rationalization, this would cause religious influences and the authority of religion to diminish. And they fully expected that religion would really start disappearing by the end of the 20th century under this theory. But it didn't turn out that way at all. Uh, First of all, U.S. is still highly religious, even though there is a rise in secularism. But worldwide, people are just notoriously religious, and so this theory uh, just didn't pan out. And now a lot of those who wrote about that, as I mentioned earlier, I think that they have said, well, that theory has turned out to be incorrect. And in fact, one of the main people, Peter Berger, I just saw something not too long ago where he was talking about the fact that no, we don't live according to that theory. We should be a secular society, but he says we're not. We're a pluralistic society, and we have all kinds of religions and spiritual thinking, and so that theory has not worked out like the early sociologists who wrote about it thought. But we're still seeing some rise in that, and out of in the U.S., out of all the different worldviews and religions, secularism is one of the ones that is challenging Christians the most, and that's why we have this section in here to talk about secularism. But we will stop the second lecture of the series of lectures on the rise of modern secularism, and we will pick up here in the next session. So stay well.